Hey there folks, Finley here. This is a short lecture on Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton, which we'll be watching in class. You have heard me say, only sort of partially in jest, that I think that Hamilton is the most important musical of the last 20 years. Maybe one of the most important musicals of my life. And so instead of just sort of saying that lightly, we're going to actually break that claim down. We're going to look at it from three directions. Objective quality, cultural importance of the narrative and characters, and then the transformative impact on the medium. So what do I mean by objective quality? Well, just as we've talked about personal aesthetic for years now. Objective quality is the opposite of that, right? How good is something that we can sort of all agree on. And Hamilton, like a great many Broadway musicals, has very high objective quality. There are amazing performances that have been captured on film here. Incredibly impressive lyrics from a technical standpoint in terms of rhyme, in terms of meter, in terms of the conveyance of information. There are moving character arcs for this very wide cast of characters. Amazing choreography, just really astonishing stuff that helps move the narrative as well as create a sense of world and character. Design that both evokes the time as well as allows us to move quickly through years. So lots of incredibly high objective quality. The work of the individual artists in this, very, very high. Now, of course, there are other shows. If I'm making the argument that Hamilton is the most important show of the last 20 years, I need to acknowledge that there are other shows. And when it comes to objective quality, other shows have equally high objective quality. If we think of one of my favorite shows from the last several years, Come From Away, astonishing objective quality in terms of choreography, character, all that. If we think of one of the most popular shows of the last couple generations, Wicked, again, high objective quality in terms of design, in terms of choreography. And also when we speak of objective quality, we need to acknowledge that there are weaknesses in objective quality with all these shows, including Hamilton. When it comes to performances, Lin-Manuel Miranda himself is not as incredible a performer as the others. He's a very good performer. I love watching him on stage. But his vocal chops just aren't the same when we think of versus Daveed Diggs, that sort of thing. But I would say that the fun of watching him on stage comes from the novelty of seeing the creator in the world created, right? Shakespeare, we know, was not the best actor in the world, but he played Caesar, he played Hamlet's ghost, and I think we would all want to see those performances just to see him in those roles. And when it comes, again, to the objective quality of the music, again, there are arguments about this. Some people, it fits right in their personal aesthetic, and this is the best music I've ever heard. Others, if their personal aesthetic isn't in the hip-hop sort of modern music style, they may dislike it. They may think, oh, there's just too much happening here. So this is, when we speak of the music of the show, personal aesthetic comes in a lot, and when we think of the objective quality of it, there are certainly songs that are objectively very, very good. I think Schuyler Sisters, The Room Where It Happens, I think objectively are very good. But there's some inconsistency there. But again, I think that's true with all shows. And where it works in terms of those songs, when it works in terms of the performances of Renee Elise Goldsberry and Philippa Sue, which I think are just two of the greatest female performances of all time. When you think of Daveed Diggs, oh my word, both as Lafayette and as Jefferson, they are as good as anything out there. Okay, so in terms of objective quality, we've said, yes, very high objective quality. And oftentimes, I mention that first because that's often all that people look at. Is this objectively good? I mean, frankly, as you know from our class, the first thing most people look at is, does this fit my personal aesthetic? And if it does, great, it's the best musical ever. If it doesn't, it's awful, right? So separate from that, objective quality. But we can look a little bit deeper than that as well. We've established that its objective quality is online with the other great musicals. So what makes it important? Why do I say of all of these other musicals, Hamilton is more important? Well, the next one is the importance of the narrative and the characters to our current cultural moment. Aristotle referred to this as idea or theme. That is, what does the piece say? What do we as a culture, or we as an individual audience member, learn from it? And Hamilton says a lot, right? One of the critiques I've heard of Hamilton is that A. Ham is not a great guy, right? He is not a hero. He sleeps around. His ambition blinds him. He is at least partially responsible for the death of his son. Right? He's not a great guy, but that's fine because he's not the hero in this play. America is the hero, and when we think of that, then when we think about what do we learn? We learn a lot about America in this play. We learn that it's a place where hard work and determination is rewarded no matter your background. We learn it's a place where tyranny can be overthrown against all odds. That's useful to know. We learn it's a place where forgiveness is possible and transformative. And we learn it's a place where ambition is ultimately destructive, whether that's Hamilton's ambition or Burr's ambition. It destroys both of them. That's a lot. Those are all valid and valuable lessons. I think it can get blurry because this is not a Disney musical, right? Yes, Disney produced it. You know what I mean. By that I mean that Disney musicals use a classical structure where you have a virtuous hero. The hero embodies virtues, and we learn by doing what they do. And that's a great structure. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that structure. But if you apply that structure to Hamilton, you'll be very disappointed because he's not a virtuous hero. Nor is he a purely tragic hero either. He is a human being, right? He's based very tightly on a real human being. And so we can't sort of look at him through that heroic lens. What we can look at is the lessons we learn by observing him and other characters. Also, when it comes to theme, the question is, how far does that theme reach? It doesn't matter if your show teaches us good and powerful lessons if no one listens to it. People have listened to Hamilton. It's an 8-time platinum record. It's sold out its performances on Broadway. It's now on Disney streaming. Virtually an entire generation of American high schoolers and college-age students can quote the whole darn thing. I would argue that is a pretty wide reach for a theme. So if we compare this to other musicals that have had that wide of a reach, Phantom of the Opera, for example, has been running for decades and decades and decades. It has no theme other than love is important, right? Wicked is a better example. It's also been running, has had huge reach. The theme of Wicked is still pretty superficial. You ought to be nice to people who are different from you and have hope, believe in yourself. Great, but it's not very deep. Rent, which I have an enormous connection to, as many of you know, had a similar reach. Again, everyone in my generation can quote that entire show. But its theme, forget, regret, or life is yours to miss, it's very flimsy. So the shows that have had big, wide range tend to not have themes as deep and complex as Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story, right? If we think of Come From Away, I've mentioned that before, that has a really sophisticated theme in both its form and its function about how community can and must come together to help people. And it's a great show, but it is not reached the same way. So if we think of theme as the reach of an idea and the importance of that idea, then Hamilton is pretty important there compared to other musicals. But if we stop there, we are overlooking what I think is the most important part of this show. And that is how it is going to change the medium in which it is written. The casting of this, the deliberately casting people of color for roles that are not historically that, is a challenge to everything about modern theater. Casting to race has limited our artistic imaginations in America and the hopes of generations of actors. People saying, oh, I can't play that role because that role doesn't look like me. And directors saying, oh, you can't play that role because it doesn't look like you. That's nonsense. That's ridiculous. If you can play a role because you're a human being. And this casting, the casting of this show, is a challenge to that entire mode of thinking that says, you can't play that role, or this role needs a certain type of actor. This show went in the opposite direction of that. It didn't just go a little way off. It literally 180 degrees from that idea, and it was made stronger. Indeed, it was made legendary by that change. And I think that that change will open the door for other productions and for our whole industry. No longer will it be acceptable to cast solely by race, to say you can't play Hero in Much Ado because you aren't, you don't look like Hero looks in my head. Nor, and I'll go further, is it just a gimmick, because there have been the entire language of this play, the musical language, the design language, was created to say that these underrepresented faces belong here. It is, the whole show supports that casting and is supported by that casting. It's not, by the way, the first time that this has happened. That sort of radical casting, there are plenty of antecedents, but when you combine that radical casting with the high objective quality we discussed and the vital theme we discussed, and frankly the enormous success of the show, this is a challenge to all theater makers from now on. Rent changed the way things were cast. It made casting more diverse. It made the narratives told in the theater more diverse. And I think Hamilton does it as well. And that's why I feel that Hamilton has made the same sort of change on the medium that Rent did, while saying something more significant than Rent did. Two last very, very important points. The fact that we're having this discussion at all, the fact that this play needs to exist, is because of the original sin of America, and that is slavery. That was part of the foundation of this country, and it is a cracked and ruinous foundation. Most of the men in this play owned slaves. And while it is addressed in the play obliquely, kind of from the side, it is not addressed head on. And this is a deep and valid critique of the work. I'm going to share my thoughts on it, but I bow to the voices of African American theater goers in this, who may have a different perspective because theirs necessarily is more relevant than mine. My perspective is that there is something else that's left out of the show, and that is Hamilton's banking plan. If you ask any history teacher, they will say that Hamilton's banking plan, the creation of the National Bank, was the most important thing he ever did. That's why we remember him. That's why his face is on the $10 bill, is because he created everything, the treasury that worked, that still works today. It's barely mentioned at all. How are you going to get your debt plan through? There's, I think, 4 or 5 lines in the whole show that talk about his banking plan. It's in there, but it's only just sort of barely referenced. Why? Because that's not what the play is about. It would slow down the themes that we've discussed that the play is about. It is vital to understanding Hamilton the person, but as we said, Hamilton isn't actually the only thing that the play is about. History is simply too big to fit into even a 3-hour play, and so choices have to be made about what you leave in, what you leave out. And that means that any play, by its very nature, is less effective than a history lesson, because it's not doing a different thing. Where it can be effective is compelling us to pay attention to those history lessons when they're given, right? If we care about the characters, if we care about the world and the time, then when we go and we're in Drake's class, then we're actually going to listen to that, right? Those are two different jobs, the lesson and the compelling us to care about the lesson. Theater is very good at that second one, but it can't fit the other one. Now, in fairness, given that race is one of the primary ideas of the show, see the casting above, it may be possible that it would have been possible to more fully address the issues of slavery and still pursue those themes. In fact, there was a third cabinet battle about slavery that was cut from the production. And I wonder if that had been included, if that might have better addressed that and more directly enriched it. But I don't think it's necessarily a fault that the play doesn't focus on that, while it does implicitly and explicitly encourage us to explore it more fully outside of that. And that leads me to my final point. I know I've gone on way longer than I intended to here, but I mentioned that the casting was important because it changes the medium of theater. I think theater itself is going to be different after this play, but the casting also is part of the theme as well, in terms of the lesson that society learns from the play. By that I mean that thousands of high school students and young college students now have, who grew up listening to this and singing this and know every line of this, right? And likely another generation who will watch this on Disney Plus. They now have two Jeffersons in their head, right? The white one they learn about in the history books, and the black dynamic one of Hamilton and Daveed Diggs, right? You can't get that performance out of your head. And so vivid is that character because of the objective quality of the performance and the music and the lyrics and the choreography design. See, these are all interlinked, right? That performance is so vivid, it's not possible to think of the one without thinking of the other, right? From now on, for everyone who knows this show, in every A-Push class, those two Jeffersons are going to be wrestling in every student's head, and the two Hamiltons and the two Washingtons on down. It will be impossible not to ask, why does history look like this instead of that? How can this person say this thing when it's so out of character for this other version of him, right? Those two Jeffersons and two Hamiltons are always going to be there, and therefore we're going to have to start reconciling them. And that means that a necessary critical eye has been opened onto our past without dimming any of the beauty and power of that past. It is what Shakespeare did, by the way, with the best of his histories. And we can talk about the Lin-Manuel Miranda Shakespeare connection. There's a lot going on there, but that's another lecture entirely. I've already gone way past my time. But I do think that for all of those reasons, that's why I say, not really joking, that Hamilton is the most important musical of the last 20 years. And I do think that it's going to be a really good start for us as we begin to explore the plays we're looking at this semester. Thanks again.